So let's dive right in. All right. So there's my website, joelburcat.com. Like I said, if you go to the blog page, you can find the materials for today's program, as well as the special additional information on the basic writing craft library. So as soon as people heard that I was, and there's also a copy of my book. So when people heard that that I'd written a book, I started getting a lot of questions about writing and basic questions about writing. And people asked, I found the same questions over and over again, some more than others. And some questions came up maybe every time I would speak. And I've spoken quite a bit now uh, since my book came out in June. And I thought it would be an interesting thing to talk about what those various things are that I've heard and just talk about those issues because these are issues that come up for anybody, whether you're a brand new writer or a very experienced writer. So let's dive right in and talk about writing a novel or writing a short story for that matter. And I did identify 10 different things in particular that I think that all beginning or even experienced writers ought to be doing. And that begs the question, are there only 10 things? And no, I probably could have written 100 things, but we only have time for 10. So we're going to talk about those 10. And then we'll, I can certainly be happy to talk with you about other things as well. I think, by the way, I'm getting some noise on the line. If, let's make sure everybody is muted, please.
Oh no, I mean I'm gonna put them in storage unit for
Could
storage.
we mute the line, please? I'm getting some noise in my ear.
Not in the damaged, not in the damaged unit, or the other ones. And that's all of
Kathy,
them.
Kathy, I think that might be you. Could you mute that line?
Okay,
Thank you.
So, and then I have them all.
All right.
Table.
All right. So, what are the things that you can do?
The other boxes of books that we had like 2 or 3 of.
Well, for some reason, there's a line that is open and not muted, and I apologize for that.
We don't need all this. No.
But we'll hopefully we'll.
I mean, there's one box of each of everything down there except for the SRT.
Hang on 1 second. Kathy?
Yeah,
Kathy?
so I just left them, but the rest of them only have one box.
Hang on. Kathy?
Whatever.
Kathy?
So I've got those in my
Apologies,
car.
everybody. We've got to mute. We mute all the lines. We mute all the lines, please, Kathy. Thank you. It's not working. Apologies to everybody. Okay, that should do it. All right. So getting into the 10 things that you should do. The very first thing, and I can't tell you how many times I've had people say to me, I've got this great story, and I've been thinking about it for 10 years, and it would make a great short story. It would make a great memoir. It would make a great novel. And where do I begin? And I tell everybody exactly the same thing, and that is sit down and write. Stop procrastinating. Just start writing. A lot of people are very concerned that what they're going to write is not going to be quality materials, and they're afraid of writing something that doesn't quite come out right. And don't worry about it. Really, don't worry about it. In her terrific book, Annie Lamott wrote a great book on writing called Bird by Bird, and she says that your first draft is going to stink. She uses a much stronger word than that, but let's just leave it at that for now. And she said that's why it's called the first draft. And she said she reminds you that no one will ever see your first draft. That's just yours. So don't worry about it. Just sit down and write. And what I find when I write is that I usually write in layers. So the first layer, it's like an artist painting a painting. The first sketch that they do on the canvas is just that, it's a sketch. And then you start filling in the details and the colors, and then you add to it, and you add to it. And it's the same thing when you write a book. You get down to the basic words at first. And when you get those basic words down, you're going to come back to that over and over again during the rewriting process. But the most important thing you've got to do is just sit down and write. You've got to get it down. I had in mind words for an opening chapter of a book that I just started. It's I'm going to try and make it a novella length book, something short, maybe 50 or 60,000 words. And it was bothering me for the longest time until I finally just wrote it down. Now, since I've written it down, I've thought of many things that I want to add to it, and a lot of color that I want to add to it to make the scene more vivid. But the most important thing that I had to do was just to get it down. So my very first piece of advice to you is, if you've got something in mind, sit down and write. Don't worry about what it's going to look like. Just get the words down. They're your words. You can do whatever you want with it after that, but get it down, stop procrastinating, and write. The other thing that I get, and this is going to surprise some people, and that is that a lot of people, more than you would imagine, have said to me, I'm not a big reader. I don't read that many books, but I want to write a novel, but I just don't like to read that much. Well, I'm going to tell you something. You've got to be a reader to be a writer. And I don't mean that you've got to be one of these super readers who reads, 300 books a year or 100 books a year, but you've got to sit down and you've got to read books if you want to write books. It's important for you to do that, if for no other reason, just that you can identify and see what it is that other writers are doing in your genre. So what I mean by that is, if you want to write thriller novels, that's great. I like to read and write thriller novels. But what you've got to do is sit down and read the classics in the thriller novel genre, meaning that you should be reading James Patterson and Lee Child and other great writers in the thriller writer genre. And that's important for you to do so that you can understand what it is that is expected of you when people are reading your book. And those people could obviously be your readers, your audience someday. It could be your publisher, it could be your agent. So you need to be able to do that to understand what's happening in the genre. The other thing too, and this is really important, and I emphasize this and try to do this myself as often as I can, is if you want to be a good writer in a particular genre, you've got to read people who are debut writers. A debut writer would be a person who's written their first book, published their first book. So I'm a thriller writer. The International Thriller Writers Association, of which I'm a full member now, has a program for debut writers. Last year, they fated 25 of us debut writers. So there were 25 new books written by 25 thriller writers. And the reason you want to read these debut writers is because whereas people like the James Pattersons and the Lee Childs are going to show you, what the traditional, been around forever, classic, highly successful writers are doing, you want to see what the new guys are doing. What are the new guys up to? What are they? Where are they going with your genre? And whether your genre is literature, or whether it is romance or mystery or thrillers or whatever your genre would be, I think it's really important for you to spend some time reading people who have written their very first book. And that'll give you a very good indication of where your genre is going. So obviously something you've got to do is to read. Oh, let me say this too, and this is sort of a counterintuitive, but I try not to read especially fiction, but especially thriller fiction, when I'm actually writing a thriller story. And I found over time that if I'm reading, let's say, Lee Child, when I'm writing a thriller story, and I go back and I reread the chapter that I was writing while I was reading the Lee Child, it looks a heck of a lot like Lee Child or James Patterson or whomever it is that I'm reading at the time. So I kind of switch over at that point and I read nonfiction. I might read historical fiction, but I'll read something that is not in the thriller genre, maybe just plain literature. Actually, even literature, I found myself copying Cormac McCarthy once. So I've got to be careful with that. But the bottom line is, if you want to be a writer, you've got to read. So the next question that I get from at least once, sometimes twice at every program is, well, what am I going to write about? I'm a teacher and I really know education, and I'm going to blow the doors off my high school or my college, or I'm a lawyer, or I'm a doctor, etc. I think I might want to write about that, or maybe I want to write about something else. But what do I write about? And I would say that as a new writer, if you're going to write your first novel, I would recommend that you write what you know. So if you're a lawyer, write about lawyers. If you're a doctor, write about doctors. If a geologist, write about geologists. And the reason for that is you're going to understand the lingo, you're going to understand the slang, you're going to understand the details and the depth that readers want to get when they're reading your book. And so I think at least early on in your writing career, it's a good thing for you to do that. Now, I've probably written, I don't know, 30 or 40 short stories in the course of my life, and very few of them have been about lawyers, but mostly they've been about just things that have inspired me to write. But at least in terms of my books, I've now written 3 environmental legal thrillers, and I've got another one started, and I've written a couple of other books as well. But I think as a starting point, it's a good place to begin to write what you know. The other side of that coin is that you can write about what you research. So, the example that I like to use is presidents. There are many, many books that are out there, fiction books about presidents. I only know of one that was actually written by a president uh, when uh, when James Patterson combined with Bill Clinton to write a book a couple of years ago. The President is Missing. So that's the only one that I know of where a president actually wrote a book, a fictional account of being a president. But the other books that are out there are, some of them are really good books, and they've not been written by presidents. So the people who wrote those books did a lot of research. Maybe they one time worked in the White House, whatever it was, but they were not president. And the point that you want to do is, the thing that you want to be thinking about is um, how do you do enough research to be able to uh, get the jargon, the lingo, the you know, the setting and all of that other stuff. But that's an important thing for you to do, is to make sure that you do a lot of research. And the research, by the way, is not watching something on television and saying, "Oh, okay, that's how those people talk. I guess I'll put that into my novel." Now you've got to really do some good, solid research to be able to write a book that is primarily researched. The other thing too is to think through your story from the beginning to the end. Very often, I've talked with people who tell me that they have a terrific vignette that would make a great scene in a book. Well, that's one scene in a book that's going to be 300 or 400 pages long, and you have to be thinking, how am I going to make that scene? Maybe it's the centerpiece. Maybe that's the most important aspect of your book. But you've got to think through beginning, middle, and end. How do I make this an entire novel so that it's not just simply the one vignette, or just stringing a couple of vignettes together? You need to think through all of that stuff so that you have a uh, a novel, or you have a short story. But you've got to think that through. The next thing, and this comes up all the time from people who have been thinking about writing, and that is that they hear that some people use outlines, and that they also hear that some people don't use outlines. There are good reasons to write an outline of your book, and that is in particular because it gives you the opportunity to think through the beginning, the middle, and the end of your book. Think through who your characters are, think through what they're going to do. And your outline could be very, very detailed, like J.K. Rowling writes very detailed outlines of her books. And or it could be something very short. It might just be something on the back of an envelope. Who are your main characters? How's the book going to start? How's it going to end? And you could do that in a page or so. It could be thought bubbles. It could be there are a lot of different techniques for writing an outline. And then there are people who swear by never using an outline. I've listed here just a couple of the people that I'm aware of who do use outlines. J.K. Rowling, of course, and Joseph Heller, both are or were outliners. And then the people who don't use outlines are referred to in the trade, in the craft, as seat of your pantsers, or sometimes just pantsers. So you've got your outliners and your pantsers, and that would include Lee Child and Stephen King, both of whom say they never use outlines. I heard a presentation done by Lee Child 2 years ago. And of course, keep in mind, Lee Child is Lee Child, probably one of the three most successful writers of our generation. And he said the only thing he knows when he starts a book is the first paragraph. That's it. And then he said Jack Reacher just takes him wherever Jack Reacher's going. So of course he's Lee Child, and I'm not Lee Child. And maybe there's a Lee Child on the program right now listening in, but at least for now, Lee Child can get away with that. I certainly don't quite go to that extent. My personal preference is when I started out writing novels, I did write detailed outlines. Now I shy away from an outline, but I do use an outline for complicated parts of my story. So if there's something that really requires, a lot of zigzagging and to get from point A to point B, I'll outline that. And what I've also done in one story is I wrote about half the story using an outline. I knew what the ending of the story was going to be, so I wrote the last chapters of the book. And then I just connected the dots, if you will, and wrote from where I ended up at about page 150 of the book to what I'd written as the ending of the book. And that worked pretty well for me. It's a personal preference. I suggest if you're writing your first novel, consider using an outline. Writing courses. And I think that is something that you do want to do as a writing course. And let's do this. So writing courses are very, very important. When you went to high school, you probably took English, maybe creative writing. When you went to college, you probably took a few English courses. And now it's years later, you've been writing as a lawyer, writing as a scientist, writing as a teacher, whatever it is that you've been writing. And that writing is very, very different than the kind of writing that you did that you would be doing rather as a fiction writer. Fiction writers are writing fiction, and the style of writing fiction is just remarkably different than any of the writing that you'll do as a professional. When I was in law school, I took a course called Legal Writing. It was 10 weeks, and it might have been subtitled Legal Writing or How We Can Suck the Lifeblood Out of Your Creative Writing, because writing as a lawyer is very different. In fact, in many ways, what you write as a lawyer is kind of the opposite of what you write as a fiction writer. And I'm sure it's the same for other professions as well. Scientists and engineers have a very particular kind of writing. Lawyers have a particular kind of writing, and that's not what people who are reading fiction want to read. And for that matter, if you're reading good nonfiction, just think of some of the great history books that you've read. Those really good history books are written in a way that is very readable and almost read like fiction. Not that they are fiction, but you understand what I'm saying is that it's a very different kind of experience than the kind of staid writing that you might have done. And even if you did, took a good writing course when you were in college, keep in mind that some of the things you're going to be doing as a fiction writer is very different than what you might have learned in a college English course. And by that, I mean, you're going to focus a lot on things like really nerdy things that you have to know about, like point of view, characterization, plot, pacing. These are not necessarily things that are taught in most English classes unless you take a really good creative writing course. And if you took a really good creative writing course, and that was 20 or 30 years ago, things have changed. And so the way people were writing fiction 25 or 30 years ago is different than the way people are writing fiction today. Where do you find these courses? There are a lot of good courses that are out there. A lot of organizations have writing classes. So for example, the International Thriller Writers Association, Writers Digest, Romance Writers of America, all of these organizations, these craft organizations, have writing courses, online and in-person writing courses. I know that there are some going on right now, even as we speak, writing classes that are focused very much on very particular subjects within the writing genre that you might want to do. And then there, like I said, the more generalized ones, I I always had trouble with point of view, which is a very important component if you're writing a story in fiction. And I would find that in some of my chapters, I would jump around from different points of view within a single chapter. So I went to Rosemont College and I took a day-long course on point of view. That's all we talked about. You want to talk about nerding out? We nerded out on point of view. So that was very helpful for me and something that I got a lot out of. There's another thing that you can do. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen this year. I'm sure they've been mostly canceled by now, but certainly next year, hopefully, when we get back on track, many colleges with writing programs have weekend long or 5 day long or even 7 day long programs on writing. Usually they're taught right after the college semester ends. So if the college semester ends, say at the end of May, this program might be taught in the beginning of June. In Pennsylvania, which I know best, Gettysburg College offers that, Rosemont College offers that, Point Park College offers that, but many, many other colleges offer these writing programs. Typically, they're taught both by professors at the university who are looking to teach for another week or so, and also they generally bring in really good top-notch writers because they're whether they have some affiliation with the university or affiliation with the program, they'll bring in a couple of good writers, well-known novelists and poets and short story writers and people who are known in various genres to come in and teach classes. So I would suggest that you go online and take a look. You'll see many of these programs. The other thing too that's nice about them, a couple things. One is that I've looked and they all seem to be, I'm going to say, fairly reasonably priced. That means in the hundreds of dollars. So that's not too expensive for most people who want to pursue their writing career. Um, the other thing too is that sometimes these classes offer you an additional add-on of room and board, which means in a college dorm and dormitory food, which, by the way, I understand is a lot better today than it was when I went to college a few years ago. And it enhances your overall experience. It gives you the opportunity of being with other writers and getting to know other writers and doing something with other writers that is different than just sitting in your writing room, like where I am right now, and sitting all by yourself writing. It gives you an opportunity to meet some colleagues who are writers, and that's fun to do. Related to that is, do you need an MFA? And I'm going to say, if you want an MFA, if you want to pursue an MFA, if you have the time and the money to do that, then by all means do it. But I don't think you need an MFA. There are many, many well-known writers out there today, and certainly in the past, who don't have MFAs. If you have the inclination, the interest, and desire to do it, by all means, pursue your MFA. But I don't think it's necessary for you to do if you want to be a great writer. The important thing is that you've got to write. So, sit down and start writing, start going to classes, and start pursuing your career as a writer. Well, let's go back to this. So we talked about the writing courses that are out there, and I do suggest that you look into those various kinds of courses. Some are very, very oriented to a particular genre, but even the ones that I've attended the International Thriller Writers conferences 3 times now, and many of them are just the nerdy writing subjects, such as point of view or pacing and that kind of thing. And I suspect that all of the different organizations teach similar kinds of classes as well. Another thing that you need to start looking at are writing guidebooks. There are some terrific books out there. I've shown 3 covers here of 3 different books that every writer ought to have in their collection that they ought to have read. Everybody has somewhere in their library. If you went to and took a college English course, you have Strunk and White's little thin book called The Elements of Style. I wore my first one out, and I have another one that's the newer version of this. But it's the basic writing book. I don't know, maybe it's 60 pages long, if it's that long at all. And even though it was written by a white in the early part of the 20th century, and William Strunk then revised it and updated it, and you'd say to yourself, well, gee, this book is 70, 80 years old now. What value is it? It is as valuable today as it was when it was first written. Definitely something you have to look at. It'll take you a short period of time to get through, like less than an hour to get through, and it is a real important thing for all writers to look at. Two other books that I highly recommend. One is Stephen King's On Writing. King wrote this terrific book that is about 50% writing guide and 50% memoir. So it's not scary if you're worried about that. And Stephen King is only maybe the most successful writer alive today. And keep in mind that he's written many different kinds of books, mostly in the horror genre, but he's written some other books and short stories that have not been in the horror genre. But he writes this book for everyone who's a writer, and has some terrific guidance for you as a writer. Keep in mind, some of this is particular to Stephen King. One thing that sticks in my mind is that he says, don't worry about the length of your story. If it's going to be 400 or 500 or 600 pages, it doesn't matter. Stephen King can get away with that. Maybe you can't, but obviously, like anything else, you want to read it with a grain of salt. But I would highly recommend that you read King's On Writing. Another book that you really ought to take and read is Annie Lamott's Bird by Bird. Another book that is maybe 50% writing guide and 50% memoir. She's a terrific writer, and she's written an excellent book, coming at it from a different perspective than Stephen King. She's more literary oriented, whereas Stephen King is more genre oriented. And so you'll see there's some differences between those two books. If you want a complete list of really some of the top books, it's not a 100-page list. It's a 2 or 3 page list of the books that you can and should have for your library. Go to my website, joelburcat.com, go to the blog section, and you'll see an entry for Basic Writing Craft Library. And that will direct you to these 3 books, but it will also direct you to another 20 or so books that I've compiled along with Jerry Krotow, who's a romance writer, and some of my thriller writer friends, and then just a couple of references to some websites. There are many, many, many websites out there as well. Some of them are very, very helpful. I just point you in the direction of a couple of them, but those are all helpful resources. Let's talk for a minute or two about critique groups. And I think that they're a good thing to do. I know some writers who hate the idea of going to a critique group, but I think if you want your writing to get out into the public, you're going to have to sit down in a critique group and let people critique your work. So generally speaking, the way a critique group works is that you circulate 5 or 10 pages of your writing, and then the group criticizes it. I'm a member of 2 groups. One I attend a lot, and that's the Midtown Writers Group in Harrisburg. And we circulate our writing in advance, and then we meet afterwards, and everybody's to have read the writing prior to the meeting. And we go around in a circle, and each person's chapter or each person's short story gets discussed by all of the people present. And it's a very helpful thing for me. I learn an awful lot by doing that. And some things that you're not sure about, people will identify for you whether or not they worked or whether they didn't work. And it's a very, very constructive critique group. I also attend from time to time the Pen Writers group that meets in New Cumberland, Pennsylvania. They do it a little bit differently. You circulate a 5 pages of your writing, but you do it right at the meeting, and then everybody reads it and then criticizes it right away. There's a difference between a good critique group and a bad critique group. And I think when people are thinking about not wanting to attend a critique group, what they have in mind are the bad groups. There are some people, believe it or not, who are very highfalutin, and they think that their writing is really superior to other people's writing. They're highly critical and in a negative way. They're not beyond using ad hominem attacks on you. And if you find yourself in that kind of a critique group, just leave. Don't come back. There's no reason for you to put yourself through that. Go find yourself a good critique group. By the way, my critique group, the Midtown Writers Group, we're now going to go to a Zoom platform starting next month, and I suspect quite a few other critique groups are doing the same thing, so that they continue with their efforts going forward. So I think you'd be able to find critique groups online, and like I said, I'm sure many of the ones that generally meet face to face will now be meeting online. So now you've written a chapter, now you've written a short story, and you take a look at it, and you go to your critique group, and some of the people in the critique group say, you know, this second paragraph here, I like the rest of it, but this one not so much. And you, on the other hand, love all your words. You think every single one of your words is just pure gold. I'm going to tell you that every writer, and I don't care who it is, I don't care if it's Joyce Carol Oates or if it is, you know, Stephen King, that the fact of the matter is not every time they put two words together are they great words. And there are times you just have to ditch some of the stuff that you've written. Think about it this way. If there's something in your story that you don't think is great, or that your critique group doesn't think is great, or that your spouse doesn't think is great, and when you look at it objectively, you say, maybe it's good, maybe it's not good, I don't know. If it's really not good, then readers aren't going to like it, agents aren't going to like it, publishers aren't going to like it. So why not just do what you've got to do, cut it out, and get rid of it? What you can do is what I do. I have a separate document that I start whenever I'm doing any kind of writing, and I call it outtakes. So if I take out a paragraph or a sentence or even a chapter, it'll go into the outtakes file. And that way, when I do that, if there is something that happens to be good in there, or some thought or some plot that I want to highlight, I can just go back to it later on and pull it out and reuse it. Stephen King isn't the first one to say this quote here at the bottom of the page, but he certainly said it in a way that I think we can all relate to. Kill your darlings, even when it breaks your egocentric little scribbler's heart, kill your darlings. And that just means that you've got to get rid of those darling words that you realize are really not as good as they ought to be. One of the semi-insulting questions that you get when your novel first comes out is, hey, this writing thing, it's not really that hard, is it? And you know, sometimes that's accompanied by the next question that we'll talk about. But let me say that it is really hard work. It is hard work because there's every aspect of it it can be very, very difficult and challenging. Getting your thoughts together so you can write that chapter or write that short story itself may be relatively easy, or it may be difficult. I'm working on chapter 2 of a book right now. Chapter 1 just flowed. It was unbelievable to me how fast I was able to write that very quickly. Chapter 2, on the other hand, I don't even know where to begin it, and I'm just going to sit down and just write it because it's difficult. But I actually, I'll tell you, this morning, literally, I woke up at 4:00 in the morning, and my subconscious was working on it. And because when I woke up, I had some thoughts in my mind about what I might do with it. And I jotted them down, and I went back to sleep. And now I see that they're not really all that good, but my subconscious is working on it. So you're working on these things all the time, and it can be a difficult thing for you to do, but it can be really, really hard, and especially in the rewriting, when you write that chapter and then you go back and you say, oh man, I wrote that whole chapter in passive voice. Nobody wants to read passive voice. Or I had 5 different points of view in 2 paragraphs. And that just doesn't work. Nobody does that. It's confusing, and you've got to go back and rewrite it. So what you find is that sometimes different aspects can be easier than other aspects, but in the end, it all can be pretty hard. Meaning that getting the story down may be difficult or hard. Doing your first rewrite may be difficult or hard when you start realizing all the junk that you put in your chapter in your writing, and then going back and realizing that you've written the same word, exact same word, 10 times on one page. When my first book, Drink to Every Beast, came out, just before it came out, Kathy Teets, my publisher, wrote me an email and she said, "Do you know you use the word that 5 times on every page?" I was shocked. I went back and I took a look and she was right. I had it many, many times on every page. She told me that a lot of lawyers happen to do that. At least I didn't use the word said, as in said document or said person. So I had to go through and I had to remove as many of the unnecessary that's as possible. And even in my more recent writing, I see that I still do that. So it's just one of those things that can be really hard is making sure that all of the different components come together in a way that that is going to be enjoyable for somebody to read later on. At the same time, and this is really, I don't know how else to say it, it's magical. And that is that there are times when your characters will speak to you. I don't know how that is, and I didn't experience it until I really started getting serious about writing about 10 years ago. But there are times when you'll wake up in the middle of the night and in your head, in your subconscious, I guess your brain is just working, but your characters will be telling you what they want to say. And if you do like I do, you have a piece of paper or notebook to the side of your bed, you write it down, go upstairs or wherever your writing room is, you put it on your into your story. But your characters really will tell you what they want to say. More, it's almost as though they are really telling you these things. And I know it might sound a little bit funny, but it's just something that happens. Every writer experiences that. Or you've got in mind a certain thing that you're going to do. First this, and then that, and then this. So you start out and you write your first thing, and then you want to go here, but your characters want you to go over here. And so you follow your characters. Your character, and the next thing you know, the chapter doesn't end over here, but it ends over there someplace because that's what your characters tell you they want to do. So that's a kind of a magical thing because then you take a look at it and you say, oh, that really makes a lot more sense. Your characters, in a way, know what they want to do sometimes better than what you consciously think they should do. The writer Nicole Bernier says that she goes into her writing room and she sits with her imaginary friends. And I love that description because in a way, that's really what they are. Your characters become your imaginary friends. And in some respects, they become, you have a more intimate relationship with them than you do with your real friends because you spend so much time with your imaginary friends. It can be a magical thing. At the same time, it can be a really hard thing to do. So let's go back to this. All right. So related to the last question is the question that I get once, I think, every time I speak, and that is, how long will it take? And sometimes the question, let's say in previous years, the question might have been, I was thinking about writing a novel, Super Bowls in February, and March Madness begins obviously in March. And what I was thinking about doing was writing a novel during that time period. And it's, I'm going to say that for the most part, it's very difficult to write a novel in a very short period of time. Most, especially beginning writers, are going to find that even just finding the time so that you can regularly sit down and write every day of the week for a couple of hours itself is difficult. And then the words just aren't going to flow out of you the way that you want them to. Sometimes a good writing day is 3,000 words. Sometimes a good writing day is 1,000 words. And sometimes you've written 2,500 words at the end of the day and you take a look at them and you say, you know what? This is all junk. I've got to throw it all out and start over tomorrow. There are many, many different techniques on how to end the day. So that some writers will actually end the day not writing the last chapter of or last sentence of a chapter. They'll hold back the last sentence of the chapter, or they'll write so that the next day they can write that last sentence and then keep going into the next chapter, or they'll write the first sentence of the next chapter so that they get a head start on the second chapter. But it's going to take you longer than you think. I'm going to say you should count on it taking about a year to write a novel of, say, about 100,000 words. Um, some of it is going to be because you're going to have other obligations, other things to do, a day job like I had for most of the time that I've been writing, or you're going to have distractions or family or other obligations and the like. So here are some books and the amount of time that purportedly it took to write those books. The shortest one I found was A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, 3 weeks. Casino Royale by Ian Fleming, 2 months. And Twilight by Stephanie Meyer, 3 months. Probably most of us are not going to be in these categories. It's going to take us a lot longer. Maybe not as long as it took R.R. Martin to write the original Game of Thrones, which took 5 years, or J.D. Salinger 10 years to write A Catcher in the Rye. But it will take you, I would count on it taking a year. And by the way, a year meaning a year to do your first draft and then to do a number of rewrites so that it's at the point where you would feel comfortable circulating it to other people to read. You certainly are not going to circulate your first draft to other people. So somewhere, second, third, fourth draft, I would count on it taking about a year. The other question that published writers always get is, yeah, after I spend the next month writing my novel, which should be a really easy thing to do, I'm going to go out and get myself an agent, and then I'll get it published by Penguin. And the reality of it is that, and this is a spoiler alert, that your first novel probably won't be published. I hate to tell you this, but I've talked to many writers, and my own experience is that your first novel, sometimes called a starter novel, and you're going to make many mistakes. And it will take you 2 or 3 or more novels to get to the point where you've actually honed your craft to the point where that your writing is good enough that it's going to be approaching publishable. So getting an agent is a hard thing to do. Agents get sometimes dozens, they say, sometimes hundreds. I don't know really how many they get, but they get a lot of manuscripts, and they're conservative and selective. So getting an agent is very difficult. And even if you do get an agent, I believe the statistics are only 1 out of every 4 books, manuscripts rather, that are obtained by agents are actually published. So don't count on even being able to publish, even if you get an agent. But getting an agent is a very difficult thing to do. So then the next alternative is going direct to a publisher. And this does not require an agent. So you would now go to what's known as an independent publisher, an indie, or sometimes referred to as a small press. And the small press are very selective also, but you avoid having to go through the step of getting an agent. The agent step might slow you down by 6 to 12 months, assuming you get published. So it is a way of getting into publication a lot faster than if you have to go through an agent. So going direct to the publisher is a good alternative. There are many indies out there. Headline Books, my publisher, is an indie, so I don't have an agent, and Headline Books is the publishing house that publishes me. But you go online and you'll find the names of quite a few other indies that are out there. Small press, they're sometimes referred to, as opposed to the large press, the Harcourts, the Penguins, and the like. Another alternative, and you hear about this all the time, is self-publishing. And usually you'll hear people say, yeah, why don't you just self-publish? It's so easy. And in a way, it's very easy, and in a way, it's also very difficult to self-publish. By that, I mean, if you go to Kindle Direct Press, and they are the 2,000-pound gorillas. Actually, I see here in my notes, I say the 800-pound gorilla. It's a big gorilla, let's put it that way. It's fast. If you have a manuscript ready to go, and you plop it into the Kindle Direct Press template, you can get your book out in a couple of days, literally. The real problem with it is a couple things. Number one is everything is left to you. You have to do the graphic design. You have to do the editing. You have to do the proofreading. You have to do the cover. And everything else is up to you. And that also means all the publicity, all the marketing. It's all on you to do that. Kindle or Amazon will do a small amount of marketing for you for a few weeks after your book comes out, but then it's entirely up to you to do the rest. So that's a way of going. In one way, it's very easy. In another way, it's very, very difficult. Bear in mind that the most recent statistics are for the past couple of years, there have been 350,000 books a year that are being self-published. KDP is the biggie, but there are quite a few other self-publishing venues that are out there as well. One other thing you've got to bear in mind is that many bookstores will not handle self-published books. So the local one that we have here in Harrisburg that is a big local bookstore, Midtown Scholar. If you're a local guy or gal and you want to get your book and you have a self-published book, they may take your book on a consignment basis. The same thing with Cupboard Maker Books, which is another local bookstore. But for the most part, they are not handling self-published books. And finally, in the publishing world, there's something called the vanity press, which is where you pay them to publish your book. And the universal recommendation is that you avoid them because they're just looking to make a buck off of you, and probably not the way to go if you're serious. If your book is a decent quality book, there are other ways to go than the vanity press. So those are my 10 things. Did I mention to you that I wrote a book, Drink to Every Beast? Actually, Drink to Every Beast is my 5th book. Like I said before, your first one is not likely to get published, or your second one, unless you're really, really an unusually outstanding writer. So Drink to Every Beast is my book. We're going to read from it in a minute. But I will tell you that it's available, like I said, today at Headline Books. They have a special deal, free shipping, and you get an autographed, personalized book if you do that right now. Go to headlinebooks.com and follow the instructions there, and you can get the book. We'll autograph it for you right here online. I've got one request for a book already, and I will autograph that in a moment. And then if other people would like a copy of the book, I'm happy to do that, autograph it, and then we'll get it out to you at no shipping cost. And now the outline, like I said, of today's program is on my website, joelburcat.com. Go to the blog page. Plus there is the additional information that I have on the various books that you can, and literary guides that you can use. So I would suggest that you take a look at that if you want to see a basic writing craft library and start building up your library. So let's pause here and come back to this. There we go. All right, so I've been asked to read a few pages of Drink to Every Beast, and I'm happy to do that, just a couple pages for you. By the way, if you're wondering, and you see my iPad here, I think many of you know that I am legally blind, which makes my life all the more difficult. I can't read a book, which is really a tragedy for me because I really like to read and hold books in my hand. I can't read this. So that's a really unpleasant thing, but thankfully I can read a screen. And my monitor, which is over here to my left, which is why I keep looking over there, is a yard wide, and it enables me to blow up the letters to a large size and bold and dark black. So, we do what we have to do. In any event, so here we are in chapter 1 of Drink to Every Beast. This is about halfway into the chapter. A fly buzzed Peter's face, and he opened his eyes. He cursed and swatted. Then his eyes grew wide with horror. The canoe, with their shirts and cell phones, was drifting downstream. Oh, shoot, the canoe. Peter let go of Cindy and raced toward the water, hopping from the boulders to the sandy riverbank. He glanced over his shoulder. We've got to get it before it goes too far downstream. Help me. Cindy pressed one arm across her breasts and followed him into the water. Peter waded in about 10 feet behind the canoe. The water deepened. He dove in and swam as hard as he could. He passed the tunnel. The putrid odor made him gag. Dead fish brushed his lips, grazed his chest, and disintegrated. Slime streaked his flesh. He held his head above the noxious gray water pouring from the shaft, Cindy just a few feet behind him. Peter reached the canoe about 20 feet from the shore. Cindy screamed as he grabbed the gunwale. Peter, my eyes are burning. There's something on my face. It's on fire. Cindy rubbed her eyes and face. Peter released the canoe and reached for Cindy. She flailed in the water, her skin a sickening crimson. Then he started burning too. His arms were bright red. Blisters sprouted on his hands. What the hell? Peter yelled as he coughed and retched. Cindy bobbed helplessly, no longer swimming. Peter, she wailed, her face streaked with tears, blood, and filth. Already gasping for breath, she coughed and allowed the venom into her mouth. Gobs of mucus and bile poured from her lips and nose. Peter reached for her arm, and she screamed at his touch. Cindy screamed. Then her scream became a howl, and her howl became a shriek. She stopped screaming only when her voice gave out. End of chapter 1. You want to find out what happened to Peter and Cindy? You have to read on.